Usually when an ID is released in Limbus Company, it is normal for there to be discussion and debate on how good the ID really is. It can take a few days before people fully understand the intricacies of certain IDs. Some take a little bit longer, and some take a lot longer. No other ID truly matches up to Sunshower Heathcliff in terms of a controversial release. Not that kind of controversy, we just really didn't understand what he was supposed to do. People called him every name under the sun. Underrated, overrated, better than you think, worse than you think. Personally, I was disappointed with this kit. Following N. Sinclair as the second negative coin ID was never going to be easy, but Sunshower Heathcliff was just not good. I don't think anybody can deny this. Hey, I'm just telling the truth. There's no need to get violent or anything. However, things have changed quite a bit since his release, and it's about time someone tried to make a guide on how to use this guy in the modern Limbus era. Why me? Well, it wasn't by choice. I'll admit this was a journey, going from knowing very little about this ID to trying to pick apart every little interaction where he may be good or even just usable. You may also notice this video is far too long considering this is just for one ID. I've included timestamps in the description for the 3 sections this video is going to be broken down into. Those 3 sections are the kit overview, how and when to use Sunshower Heathcliff, and lastly, my thoughts on him and what I would change about him, if anything. So strap in. This ID is complicated and difficult to explain, but I will try my best to give a sufficient overview of Sunshower Heathcliff so you can better understand how to use this unique ID. Starting with... Let's start with the most glaring thing about Sunshower Heathcliff. He is a negative sanity ID, meaning instead of wanting to hit heads and raise his skill ceiling like the vast majority of IDs, he wants to hit tails to maintain his floors. Sunshower Heathcliff's skills are pretty notorious for being terrible, but let's take a look at these skills in depth. Are they that bad? His skill 1 is Umbrella Thwack. This skill has a floor of 6 and a ceiling of 0, due to how negative coins work. It gives him sinking count on use, 3 sinking on clash lose, and actually inflicts decent sinking potency and count. For those who don't know, sinking lowers sanity by the sinking potency whenever hit, then the count is lowered by 1. Before we go any further, we need to discuss his passive. There's a lot of text here, but I'll break it down line by line. At the start of the combat phase, Sunshower Heathcliff loses sanity by X, where X is his sinking potency. He then loses 1 sinking count. We'll talk about the rest of the passive in a little bit. For now, just know that this means after a successful skill 1, when the next turn begins, Heathcliff would lose 1 sanity, since the 1 count he gained also gave him 1 potency. He would then be left with no sinking. Now, the clash lose effect on the skill 1. This means that Heathcliff ends up with 4 sinking on him if he uses his skill 1 with no other sinking on him. This clash lose effect synergizes with 2 things in his kit. First, and probably more importantly, Sunshower Heathcliff has the completely unique effect of losing sanity upon losing a clash. The calculation for this works the same way as winning clashes, meaning it is a base value of 10, increased by 2 for every clash after the first. This means that Heathcliff can lose a minimum of 14 sanity, since all of his skills are at least 3 coins. However, the clash lose sinking also works in with his passive. The second line reads, before being hit by an attack, gain protection equal to this unit's sinking. Up to 5 protection can be gained per turn. So this means Sunshower Heathcliff always gains at least 4 protection when he loses a clash on his skill 1, and therefore takes 40% less damage from all attacks that turn. Well, that's close to how it works, but not quite. Despite literally saying that it is before the attack, it is not. This means the first hit you take in a turn is not reduced by 40%, or any percent for that matter, so this does nothing against single coin skills. That said, it is quite strong if you somehow manage to take multiple attacks, or a multi-coin skill. I know that was a lot for a skill 1, but like I said, he's very complicated. Thankfully, now you understand how he works, at least on the surface. Now let's dive deeper still. His skill 2 is Puddle Stomp. This has a floor of 10 and a ceiling of 0. However, the floor can be raised to 15 depending on how low his sanity is. Ideally, of course, you use this below 25 SP. This skill also inflicts some Rupture and spends sinking to deal plus 20% damage on his 4th coin, and also bursts Tremor. When I was initially going through Sunshower's kit again, this caught me off guard. I suppose there's no harm in it being here, but it's a really strange addition. This skill is where the majority of Suncliff's damage comes from. I've had this deal 171 damage against this guy in the Canto 4 dungeon. However, that was with 5 paralyze on me, and 3 blunt damage up from the last line of his passive. This means in almost completely optimal conditions, around high 100s of damage is what you can expect. Now that's pretty solid, right? Well, we'll talk about whether that's true later. This skill is the most self-explanatory of Suncliff's kit, however, I will talk about that sinking spent on his 4th coin. This can be good or bad depending on when you use it. Ideally, you are using this skill at low SP, so removing the sinking means you won't corrode as quickly. Using it too soon can mean messing with your cycle, but we will talk about that in a later section, so we'll quickly move on to his skill 3 for now. Spread Out is a skill Heathcliff really wants to get his passive sanity loss going. It gives him 6 sinking and 3 count, meaning you are losing 18 sanity over time guaranteed from using the skill via his passive. The floor of 18 is nice, but a ceiling of 0 once again. Most importantly though, this skill's animation is amazing. It feels very satisfying to use, so long as it doesn't roll all heads, of course. Weirdly, this skill feels most like 7 Yi Sang's skill 2. They both inflict Fragile, Rupture, and Paralyze. That aside, a next turn Paralyze is always good utility, and a next turn Fragile is good as well. So this skill is definitely Heath's best one on paper. 3 rolls of an 18 is pretty solid when compared to the rest of the cast. One thing though, why is this Pierce? His whole kit is about getting blunt damage up. Were they worried about this doing too much damage? Either way, let's just move on to his last skill, which is Warning, his counter. Now this is a very interesting skill. Floor of 10, ceiling of 0. Yes, this means that every skill Sunshower Heathcliff has can roll a 0 at the end. The best thing about this counter is probably the 5 sinking gained. Since this is on use, it's a little strange. It means you don't get protection from it since you need to be hit first before countering. However, sinking stacking is a reliable way of losing sanity for Sunshower Heathcliff, so more potency is always good. Hitting tails in the first coin also gives you a paralyze next turn, guaranteeing the first coin you roll will have a 0 value. This is great for negative coin skills and ego, since you are essentially locked at that power level. Having be only 1 paralyze kind of sucks though, since this means you still need to go unopposed, since you can very easily use it up in a clash. Alright, that's the general overview of his kit. Now let's go over his pros and cons. Pro number 1, his potential damage is quite high. Assuming you roll all tails, he is above average in terms of damage dealt. He has a high health pool with good protection, allowing him to be tanky. Notice how I said tanky and not a tank. Sunshower Heathcliff needs high effective health to function as an ID, however, he is not encouraged to take attacks for others. He's a selfish little furry who only cares about falling deeper into brain rot. Anyways, that's about it for his particular strong sides, and they are good upsides to have, but let's talk about his downsides next. He's punished far too much for rolling heads. Hitting a single heads hit on his skill 3 makes it go from a reasonable 18 roll to an 11, which just feels horrible. Claire, in comparison, immediately has an advantage since he loses SP on using his skills, meaning he will almost never be at max sanity and has, on average, a higher chance of rolling tails. Heathcliff can't clash, and doesn't want to clash. His numbers are not reliably good enough to clash, and gaining sanity from clashes is way too much of a pain to even bother anyways. The only time you want to clash is when you're super low on sanity. This makes him somewhat of a burden on the team, especially since he takes a long time to get going. You'll understand why this is the case in the next section, but just know that Sunshower Heathcliff is practically dead weight for the first 2 turns of combat if you are trying to lower his sanity. His method of losing sanity is confusing. I know Sunshower enjoyers would disagree, but I do think this is a downside. He feels frustrating to use initially, which will lead to a lot of people dropping him before trying him properly. This is bad design in my eyes. He's nearly worthless in human fights due to wanting to do unopposed attacks, and he has less control in them in general. And the last downside is that he's very resource intensive. What do I mean by that? Well, for that we need to move on to the next section of the video. Let's start with how to use Sunshower Heathcliff. And there's 2 categories to this, with ego resources and without ego resources. Let's start assuming you have infinite ego resources, at least of the types you need. Sunshower Heathcliff wants to be at low sanity, so a great way to get him down there is via ego usage. Thankfully, all 3 of his ego synergize very nicely with him. Body Sack gives him an attack power-up, always great for any ID really. AEDD's passive allows him to lean into being more sustainable, soaking hits while healing. Alongside being a strong ego, he fuels perfectly. Then Telepole. This is his strongest option in my opinion. Since this is a negative coin ego, you are rewarded for being at low sanity, and even more rewarded for overclocking and corroding this, since it rolls a massive 54 at uptide 4, assuming you have charge to spend. You can also guarantee the 54 by getting that paralyzed from the counter. However, this is really expensive to do multiple times. Even once, it costs 11 resources, let alone using more ego to keep his sanity down. However, this is undeniably very effective, and I believe the best way to play Sunshower. Get him to around negative 20 sanity, and work him down from there to begin using Puddle Stomp at full effectiveness. Conveniently, Telepulse spends 20 sanity, putting you in that sweet spot immediately. Now the realistic scenario. You're broke on ego resources and can't afford to spam. This is where Sunshower Heathcliff shows his real problems. He takes time to build downwards, and one slip-up can undo a lot of progress. On the opposite side of things, it's actually not hard to spiral out of control with multiple skill slots. A mix of using his counter and skill 3 can stack up sinking too fast on him, meaning either from taking hits or from his passive, he will corrode on reaching negative 45 sanity. So, in my opinion, how do you effectively play Sunshower Heath without abundant ego resources and just his passive active? Well, assuming we are in an abnormality fight and can choose who we clash with, it would probably be best to start with the skill 1 to try and lose the clash. If you don't have your skill 1, a counter or an unopposed skill 3 is not a bad choice. Ideally, now that you have lost the clash with your skill 1, you are at negative 14 sanity minimum. From here, another skill 1 clash lose is best. So you've lost a second skill 1 clash, now you are at negative 28 sanity. This is a great time to use your skill 3, as it will likely do good damage and set you up to lose sanity over time. You can also use your skill 2, since you have some blunt damage up from being hit, and are in range of the final power up. After this point, it's harder to say what is optimal. However, it's good to note a few things while using him. Number 1. Don't bother using his skill 2 when above negative 15 SP at least. I hate to say it, but it is practically a dead skill if you roll 2 or more heads. Since this is your main damage source, save it until you are sure you can make effective use of it. If your skill 1 clash says struggling or hopeless, it's not guaranteed to lose, since negative coin skills get better at clashing the less coins they have. Always check to see if the enemy's realistic minimum roll is above 6, then you can feel confident in always losing the clash. Don't clash with the skill 3 if you use it at neutral sanity. It's too valuable to lose out on the sinking and count. So just go unopposed to guarantee you can get your sinking stacks going at least a little bit. Do math. I know it sucks, but you need to calculate how much sanity you can lose in a turn to prevent corrosion as much as possible. Always consider that if you're losing a clash, you are always losing at least 14 to 16 sanity. For reference, here are all the potential ways you could lose sanity. Enemy abilities, please read them. Clash lose, being hit with sinking on you, start of combat phase passive, and ego usage. This is a good checklist to go through to make sure you don't go too far down the foxhole and end up killing your team with a powerful corroded telepult. Sunshower Heathcliff requires you to think, and you need to respect and be wary of that. These are all of the general tips I can give you on how to use them. They will vary from fight to fight, but I would say it is a good outline to follow. Now, when do you use Sunshower? Well, you could use him everywhere, but he is pretty bad in human fights like I mentioned before, since he really wants to be able to select his targets and do his attacks unopposed. So generally, abnormality fights are going to be far better suited for him. In terms of team compositions to use him in, he can kind of be slotted in just about anywhere. You can choose to synergize with his decent rupture potency if you want, or even run sinking with him, since his skill 1 is a decent amount of sinking. However, for both of those teams, he will run through your account very quickly, since he has 3 coins on all of his skills except his counter, which is still 2 coins. Lastly, the final section of this video. It should be no surprise at this point that I do believe Sunshower Heathcliff is flawed, cause he is. I think he is an overly complicated ID for no real good reason. Remember the 171 damage on the skill 2? That is really good damage, but it took so much setup to even get there. In the amount of turns it takes Suncliff to get down Insanity and get that going, other IDs would have done far more damage for less cost. This is only made worse without Ego, because you are ideally doing no damage since you want to lose the skill 1 clash to get lower Insanity. However, I also think fixing him isn't actually that difficult. These changes are meant to make him a little bit better, not make him the most powerful ID in the game, but at least not a confusing and somewhat messy ID like we have now. Here's how I would change Sunshower Heathcliff. His skill 1. I almost left his skill unchanged, but really, +1 sinking count just doesn't cut it. So instead, he would gain +2 sinking count. This means you can maintain higher sinking for longer, which is generally what you want, and shortens his ramp up slightly if you start with a skill 3. I would buff his skill 2's base power to 11, and remove one of the final power bonuses from his below 15 SP condition. This is simply prevent him from feeling too similar to Enclair by rolling a 16, while also adding some power into his skill 2 while not at optimal sanity. In addition, I would make the coin power only -2 instead of -3. This means his damage would be far more consistent even if you hit heads. For skill 3, I would make the coin power -5 instead of -7. This keeps it as a still risky option while not feeling like utter trash after one heads hit. I would also increase the base power from 18 to 19, just to give it a little bit of a power boost since this is his skill 3, and you can't boost this with blunt damage up, so I think 19 is pretty fair. His counter, I would make the coin power -4 instead of -5, and make the paralyze gained on tails hit instead be gained on hit. It was tempting to make this give more paralyze, but I want this buff to be as simple as possible, yet also be effective. Lastly, his passive. Obviously, the protection should trigger before the attack, like the passive implies it should. Altogether, here are the patch notes I would apply to Sunshower Heathcliff if I could. Overall, this would only serve to make him more consistent, and make maintaining his sinking more reasonable. So my actual final thoughts. I went into this video really hoping I would find something that no one else had about Suncliff. Something niche about his kit, an interaction no one had thought of. This obviously did not happen. Instead, what I found was probably the most unique ID in the game. I am known to enjoy underrated Heathcliff IDs, but Sunshower Heathcliff is fun, if you have a baseline understanding of what you should be doing with him. His animations are fantastic, the story behind the ID is interesting. It's a shame he's just not very good. Even more so since he really wants Uptype 4 resources. He gains the Clash Lose sinking and the additional final power on the skill 2 from Uptype 4, which he really wants. I think Sunshower Heathcliff is one of the biggest missed opportunities for a really interesting and powerful ID. They didn't have to make him Enclair, hell they didn't have to make him as powerful as Rabbit Heathcliff, but I think all he needs are those changes I suggested, and people would be far more accepting of him. I hope this video helps someone understand Sunshower Heathcliff better, as he is one of the most asked about IDs. Someone is constantly asking how to use him, so hey, if someone asks, and you think this video did a good job explaining it, you now have an easy way to help someone out. That said, let me know what you think of Sunshower Heathcliff and any of the big things I missed in the comments. With an ID like this, missing something is inevitable, and I always like to learn new things about Limbus and the IDs within it. See you around. This video ends. Why are you still here?